Hello and welcome back to the Object Relations lecture series. I'm Dr. Susan Cavalier Adler. I've been speaking to you about many topics related to British and American object relations theory, which I teach about all the time and have many books and articles about. I'm the founder and executive director of the Object Relations Institute, so I've taught all the various British and American object relations theorists, especially the original ones, and how I've integrated their thinking in my thinking as a clinician. Today, I'd like to talk to you about some concepts of Winnicott's from papers of Winnicott's and how they help us understand development and clinical work. So I'd first like to talk to you about Winnicott's very well-known paper on the capacity to be alone, which relates to how a child needs a mother or mothering person to be able to be with them when they're expressing their selves, their spontaneous inner self, and to not intrude on that or not to leave and abandon them so that they don't have another to be with them. The capacity to be alone comes about through having another with you that you internalize, that's benignly there and focused on you or your play as a child, or with a therapist on what you're expressing as a patient, the therapist being with you in that, not intruding with their own agenda or their own thoughts that aren't there with you at that time. That's part of a developmental aspect of treatment, where the therapist, just like the mother, can help the patient develop through being with them affectively, not just intellectually, but emotionally, with where their emotional state is and with their ability to be spontaneous in their own self-expression. So the capacity to be alone interacts with Winnicott's papers on the false and true self, or his particular paper on the false and true self, because it's the true self that evolves through internalizing the other and then allowing that spontaneity of the self to live and thrive and develop. Along with that, we have Winnicott's paper on object survival and relating through identifications. And there he talks about how important it is for both the mother and the therapist, to a good enough relative degree, not retaliate or abandon the child with the mother or the patient with the therapist when the patient or the child is expressing their instinctual aggression, and in being able to receive the projections and hostilities and contain one's reaction without retaliating or abandoning the patient, or with the mother not retaliating or abandoning the child, can be a very important part of growth, and it interacts with allowing the true self to develop. And it's a way also of being with the person, as in the capacity to be alone. Because if you survive, in the sense Winnicott talks about, the mother or the therapist surviving the aggression without retaliation, abandonment, you can be internalized as a benign, holding environment other who's with them and not against them. And this can help develop a more positive sense of the world and of the freedom of the self to be spontaneous in one's expression without terror all the time of some retaliatory attack that could be murderous and in the unconscious and really devastate the sense of spontaneity so that the person gets inhibited and disrupts development. When we talk about character disorders, we talk about disruptions in development and developmental arrest. So these 3 papers of Winnicott on the capacity to be alone, the true and false self, and the one on object survival and relating through identifications, these papers all interact around how the therapy can be a developmental process for the patient, as well as uncovering unconscious fantasy to bring it to consciousness. It can be a developmental process, and that was what Winnicott was so much a pioneer of, and so much given us the gift of development in therapeutic treatment. And then Margaret Mahler in the American School, Margaret Mahler, Masters, James Masterson, and others, Althea Horner, all myself later on, and others in the American School really built on an interactive relationship with Winnicott about how therapeutic treatment can be a developmental process as well as an exploratory one about unconscious repression. It can be also in a developmental process, particularly when there's character disorders, disruptions in developmental arrest, and there's more dissociation than repression. The focus then becomes primarily a developmental one, whereas it's secondarily a developmental one with people who have achieved the Oedipal level and whole object relations and need more of understanding the unconscious fantasies that affect them all the time that they need to become conscious of. So whether development in therapy is the primary focus or the secondary one, along with understanding intrapsychic unconscious realities within that are not conscious. In either case, development is critical in the therapeutic process. And Winnicott has given us so much, D.W. Winnicott, in his papers to help us understand this. And in his Playing in Reality papers and his maturational processes and the facilitating environment papers are primary to this developmental focus. So thank you for joining me today to understand Winnicott's contributions as I take you on different journeys through different British and American object relations theorists' contributions. In my book, The Klein-Winnicott Dialectic, we see how both Kleinian theory and Winnicott theory interact and are so potent when integrated and not polarized in clinical work. The Klein-Winnicott Dialectic, Transformative New Metapsychology and Interactive Clinical Theory, which I published in 2014 with Carnac and now is with Routledge. This book shows how there's integration of Klein and Winnicott is so primary for clinical work and should never be polarized in the way that unfortunately so many times Klein and Winnicott have been polarized. I show in that book how the psychobiographies of both Melanie Klein and Winnicott show their contrasting perspectives come from their own development. But I also show how clinical work integrates the two, even with their very varying and sometimes very contrasting perspectives. They don't have to be polarized. They can be integrated. Thank you for joining me today to discuss Winnicott's contributions and the overall view of object relations theory.